So yeah, I'm Hannah Swanson and I'm a senior business consultant at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, working in the research, innovation and collaboration team within the organisation. So I'm here to talk today. I won't be covering the technical aspects of river restoration. I'll more be talking about how we can use river restoration to deliver place-based regeneration. So in SEPA, we did this through establishing the Leaving programme, which is a partnership of public, private and third sector organisations looking at mid-Fife. So before I get into that, I'll maybe tell a wee bit of the backstory to how the Leaving programme came to be. So it started out with a water specialist in SEPA who had just come off a 10-year project on the River Garry in Perthshire. So that project was looking at a water body that basically had gone dry because it had the water was being used for hydropower. So there was a sluice gate there keeping the water to be used for hydropower, and obviously there's a lot of contention there about the sort of battle between the renewable energy generation that hydropower delivers, but also protecting and improving the local environment. So that's quite a difficult thing to balance. So this water specialist, had to be on that battle for 10 years trying to negotiate and make sure that they could return water to that water body. It was incredibly difficult, an uphill battle that whole 10 years. But in the end of it, they did succeed and were able to open the sluice gate and see that water run back down the water body. And it was an incredible achievement for the ecology and the local environment there. But to be honest, for this water specialist from SEPA, it was a bit like it should have been a champagne popping moment, that achievement, but it felt a bit like exhausting. Feeling like going on that 10-year journey and it being a fight every step of the way. It felt a bit anticlimactic. So then her next job was tasked to do similar for the River Leaving in Mid-Fife, not to return water to it because it is a full flowing river, but to address the old industrial pressures which are impacting the environment. So she went out to visit the River Leaving to start with and couldn't find it. So she was looking at the maps and going to the local communities surrounding the river and couldn't find where to access the river. It was completely lost within the landscape and wasn't something that was signposted to or anything like this. But when she did find it, she found that there was a lack of safe access along the river. So the ground was very uneven and dishevelled. There was a car in the river, and when we later engaged the community, they would describe that landscape as a wasteland. So we also found that the river was greyed out on all the local plans. So this felt really absurd because looking at the history of this area of Scotland, that river was the entire reason that those communities grew there. It was the economic powerhouse. It powered the mills and the factories which sat all along it, and then also the ties its ex-coal mining communities that are there. It was where adults worked and where children played in our history. But when industry declined and nothing replaced it, both the river and its surrounding communities were abandoned. And the history of the river was lost. A large chunk of the local population, actually, when we engaged them, weren't even aware that a river was there. So I was saying, it's kind of lost in the landscape. So they're no longer aware it's even there, or they avoid it because it's used as an antisocial behaviour hotspot. And there is a small proportion, though, who would use it for dog walking and things like that. But largely underused and undervalued when it used to be such an asset to the local community. So basically, this water specialist reflected on the past 10 years, as well as the injustice of what the river had become locally, and decided that we needed to try something different. We couldn't go on that same journey of fighting to make environmental improvements to a river that no one's going to benefit from, that the local communities won't be able to access, and how much good would that actually be doing in the grand scheme of things. So what she did was she went out there and engaged with a bunch of organisations who have an interest or a role in this local landscape. And she was armed with a map of the catchment area and the vision that we could achieve more by working in partnership on shared goals rather than in isolation on our individual remits. So those partner organisations mapped out, what are their challenges that they were struggling to achieve on their own, where are the opportunities, so where are the overlaps where organisations could work together to achieve something better. And they developed a shared vision with the river at the heart of it and bringing the river back to being a central focus for the local area. And also developed some overarching themes that we would build our projects to deliver towards. So when we develop a new project, we aim to deliver towards as many of these themes as possible. You'll see them on the right-hand side. We've got climate action, connectivity, nature rich, health and wellbeing, heritage, water innovation, resilient communities, and productive people and place. So we started out in Leavenmouth, which is that red rectangle you'll see on the map. That's where the River Leven meets the Firth of Forth, and we started there because those are the communities of most need within this catchment. We unlocked water environment funding to restore that section of the river. So that river restoration project was completed just last year, where we removed a redundant dam, Burnmill Dam, which was live streamed on Dam Removal Europe's YouTube. We created a nature-like rock ramp over another dam, which couldn't be removed because of infrastructure which is there that would have been damaged. It was a big Scottish water pipe, so we couldn't remove that. And reconnected the river to the floodplain and created floodplain ponds and much more. But basically, a river, if it's in its natural state, will be a more resilient landscape for communities. Whereas when there are physical changes to the river or it's obstructed, that can create less resilience, create a more risky environment when it comes to our changing climate.
Yeah.
But going back to that original concern about the lost heritage, what good is the restored nature if communities aren't able to access it? So that takes us on to where we were also able to access Sustrans funding to design an active travel network, which would reconnect communities to the river, but also to each other. So over time, the river became a barrier between communities, and what we wanted to do is to bring them back together. But the most powerful part of this project, in my opinion, was that we were able to engage the communities to co-develop a master plan for the river valley landscape. So that's what we call the river park. It's the natural environment surrounding the river and between these communities. So basically, we found that when focusing on the river and its story, focusing on the milling and the manufacturing history which the river enabled, and creating opportunities to explore and uncover and celebrate that history, this is what galvanised the community to engage in our programme, which was mostly nature-driven and climate-driven. But we had to be able to tap into those topics and opportunities that meant something to local people to bring them on the journey. So we used engagement activities to bring people into the River Valley and develop ideas for how it would be transformed into an open access river park. Actually, in Methil and Methil Hill, which are the communities to the south of the river, they refer to the River Valley as the dam. So they'll say, oh, are we going down the dam? And basically when we'd talk about removing the Burnmill Dam, there's this video of a teenager getting quite emotional, saying, I don't want them to remove the dam, talking about the river park. So we knew this, has some emotional ties, that the legacy of the industry lived on, but there's actually no physical evidence of that history. And we wanted to make sure that if we were removing or physically changing dams or the river, then we had to be able to interpret and memorialise the history so that it would remain for the people, because it's a great source of pride. So from that master plan that we developed with the communities, we secured National Lottery Heritage funding. So as part of this, we've got some heritage-inspired projects, and one of them is to uncover the Methil Mill, which currently you cannot see when you go into the river park. But what we're going to do is, alongside the community, we're going to excavate that mill and consolidate a few of its structures, creating some physical evidence of the history there, and provide a space for outdoor learning and community activities. But alongside that, we've got hidden heritage, which is telling the stories that have been lost over time. So something the communities there have told us as well is that, who gets to tell history, who gets to record history, tell the stories? It's usually not the working people, and it's not the regular folks like them. So it's not what you would find, their stories aren't what you'd find in books or archives or museums. So what they want to do is to be able to explore those stories about the workers, about the industries, about this landscape, and be able to tell them in a way that they want to. So they're really taking the lead on that and creating visualizations, oral histories, and physical interpretation. But then we've also got capacity building for heritage. So the existing local history groups and heritage groups were hit very hard by COVID, and some of them, like the groups, closed down completely. So what we want to be able to do is build that local capacity to own this stuff going forward. So we've got an archaeology and heritage skills programme, which will develop traditional skills and really outdoor learning and skills development to bring more people into this world of opportunities. And that will result in a paid placement. But then we've also got organisational sustainability training for existing groups in the area so that they can build their own capacity and sustainability to strengthen their organisations. And then we've also got a youth panel that we're establishing with mentoring and support to access funds so that they can deliver their own heritage related projects in the local area. But there is a backdrop amongst this that we need to recognise, and it's probably true for many post-industrial communities where you will find, heavily altered rivers and that have industrial history, is that when that industry disappears, they're left to fend for themselves. They feel neglected. There's been a lack of investment over the course of decades, which means that they're used to being overpromised to and under-delivered for. So that makes them slow to trust outsiders and less likely to engage. So we listened to them and adapted our engagement approach by creating activities that people were interested in, including art classes, archaeological digs, bushcraft for the young ones, and all of these different activities that drew people in. We organised collective engagement between our projects, but then also other local projects and groups, so that local people only need to show up to one event to engage with a bunch of activities that are happening locally and understand what's happening in their area to reduce that consultation fatigue. But as well, part of that, so we organise big fun interactive events, so things like barbecue band and a blather, which included live music, barbecue food, all completely free, and information about the projects. Or Frost Fest, which was Christmas themed, a festive day out, which was all free, fun. There was food, music. At Frost Fest, there was an ice rink and someone dressed up as the Grinch for a meet and greet with the kids. And the reason of having to do those kind of events, I mean, you wouldn't expect that from a river restoration project or from an archaeological project. You know, the reason we had to do it is because it's what the local people wanted. And we all know how much it costs to go out for a family day of fun. And this was something that they could do that would give them a bit of respite from the challenges they're facing, but then also an opportunity to light touch engage with what we're doing and a way to build our brand locally so that when they see our logo, when they hear about our projects, they have that positive association and they're more likely to get more involved going forward. But then as well, we were told by existing organisations locally and existing groups that they're stretched thin and they don't have time to show up to extra things, add more to their calendar, spend more time. So we also designed a mobile co-design workshop that we could take to different groups during their scheduled meetings, during their events, and that they could participate in that way so that we're not demanding more from them. But then as well, the ones that are established and ready to hit the ground running, we also included participatory budgets so that they could access some money to deliver the work that they're doing and take the lead on things that would deliver towards our vision. So you need a good mix there to bring them along with you. So where has this led us? On this slide, you'll see the Scottish Government directorates with our projects organised below the ones that they are delivering towards. And there are two key learnings that I take from this slide, and it's the reason I'm showing it, is that you'll see the ones for education and skills, and then also the one for culture, which we include heritage in, of course. Those ones are more heavily stacked than the other ones. And this is because we recognise that in disadvantaged communities, you need to put in maximum effort to build capacity locally, develop skills, bring people together, and reignite pride of place. Any project looking to build infrastructure to restore nature or change a place physically needs to bring communities along so that they feel ownership and take care of those assets. So this validates the place-based approach that we've taken. And then my other takeaway is that no individual project could deliver towards all of these outcomes. So we can't just focus solely on river restoration or industrial heritage exploration or transport or skills development. We need to bring them all together, and no sole organisation can do that on their own. So we need to work in partnership and we need to be willing to step into spaces that we don't usually belong and build up a good package which will deliver towards different outcomes. And then I'd just like to end on the reason that we're doing all this. So some more pictures from our engagement activities is that we are doing this all for the people who live in the places that we're operating in, essentially, at the end of the day. And we always need to remind ourselves that we can go into an area and think about our priorities and focus on our priorities. But at the end of the day, it needs to mean something for the people who live there, the people who own that environment. So that's something that we're looking to do more of by engaging with organisations we might not typically be expected to engage with, partnering up with them and considering more participatory approaches to be able to really deliver change on the ground in a way that means something to people and isn't solely about our prioritised outcomes.
Okay. First of all, I'm actually on holiday And a friend of mine is a manager at a former watermill, and they're celebrating their 200th anniversary this year. So I've got to give them a plug, seeing as they've allowed me to come into their factory. So my primary drive for the research I've just recently completed was just about climate change and climate change mitigation. So that was the pure, simple driver and focus. So I live in Belper in Derbyshire. It's in the middle of the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. And when as a group we were looking at renewable energy as a mitigating option for local communities, we could see that we could have industrial weirs producing hydroelectric power. But unfortunately, there were plenty of other ways that weren't. We looked at projects to try and reinstate them as local communities, but for a number of reasons, by about 2018, 2019, that's now impossible, which was what the purpose of the PhD. My research looked at the Derbyshire Derwent catchment. My first job was to identify all the mills that were around in sort of late 1800s. Found around 195 sites that were doing water power of different types, large and small mills. So smaller mills on the tributaries, typical corn mills, but some larger industrial mills on the main rivers as well. One of the surprise findings was how many of those sites at some point in the last 100 years had made electricity. So I found evidence of over 40 sites that at some point had made electricity in the last 100 years. There are around 18 today, but by the 1980s, there were only five. So I knew there was going to be an interesting story. And on the left-hand side there, there's a picture of a few of the mills and sites making power today, small and large. So you've got an old corn mill, an old flour mill, and a Howden Reservoir. So a variety of sites. So within my research area, based in Belper, I did find innovation in water power. So it was an important part of the story, and it may continue to be an important part of water power and the innovation. So in the Belper Mills, we saw some extraordinary developments when wood was still the primary material for water power. A couple of extraordinary water wheels that were built by William Strutt in the 1790s. 1804, we had a hybrid wheel, but by around 1808, we saw the introduction of the iron suspension wheel, which was very, very important in terms of competing with other power sources. And it took power from sort of 40 horsepower up to 200 horsepower. It was a game changer for sites that had water available. So whilst the development and innovation in water power was happening, there was also alongside it developments in steam, and steam was to become the major source of power for the Industrial Revolution. First little myth that I do keep coming across is that quite often it's talked about steam replacing water power, and the photos there are from the opening ceremony at the Olympics, where the steam replaced the water power. But in practice, certainly on the industrial mills, it was a hybrid arrangement. So if they had water power, they continued using water power. And as sites expanded and they needed more power, they added steam. So they'd use the free flowing river first and use that as a base, and then steam in addition, which is one of the first important lessons for the future, mix and balance. The next big change was the introduction of electricity. As that came along, you had to make it for yourself. There was no grid. We're all familiar with Lord Armstrong and his site at Cragside, where he converted a mill to produce electric lighting. And in my story, in my research, not too surprisingly, Chatsworth House weren't too far behind. So they were making their own electricity. And interestingly, both sites had battery storage as well, which is fairly incredible for the late 1800s. So electricity was a bit of a game changer, but it was about local generation for lighting and later for power. Gilks was one of the key turbine manufacturers and still is today in the UK. This is a part of their sales brochure from 1898, and we can see who the sorts of top clients are there. Her Majesty Queen Victoria and the royal family still are quite important in terms of buying and maintaining machinery. But yeah, it's all the dukes and lords of the country producing electric lighting for their houses, but also agricultural machinery, corns, pumps. You can see all the different applications. If you wanted this new thing called electricity, you had to make it for yourself. So actually, there was quite a deployment in mill sites. And I was stunned when talking to Gilks. They allowed me to see and get a copy of their Derbyshire sales brochure, sales catalogue ledger, sorry. And these are all turbines purchased just for Derbyshire. Some were on sites where there were replacement turbines. Some were bought by people from Derbyshire and installed elsewhere. But there was a lot more turbines being installed, and we had more than just Gilts turbines in Derbyshire. So they were quite well deployed. But also, Gilts shared their sales data. And it showed this ridiculous decline after World War II, where they were just not selling anything in the UK. And this was a pattern that matched my research in terms of water power usage. So something happened post-war. But typically, turbines that were in use before the 1940s, 1950s were still in use, were stopped being used and would go rusty. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of turbines that look like that today. But fortunately, certainly since we've needed to act regarding renewable energy and climate change, we are seeing more restorations. So that turbine that was once in the Preston Waterworks is now actually operating in the Cromford Mills World Heritage Site, along with a water wheel. So turbines are in sites that could be refurbished and producing hydroelectric power. So the story went on in terms of power development. For water power, it went from water wheels to water turbines, and the later development of the use of Archimedes screws, which are less efficient but are seen as more fish friendly. But that's a debate for other people. And what we've seen is the dominance really of the big electricity network, which was initially coal fired, and then we've gone to gas, and now we're moving to renewables. But the renewable story, we did have a little blip from about 2010 to 2018 where we started seeing a resurgence, but that stopped in 2018, largely down to the Water Framework Directive, but also down to planning issues, including heritage, and also down to the feed-in tariffs being withdrawn. So we've now in a situation again where we've got many opportunities around the country, but we can't deliver them. One of the issues in terms of the opportunities and delivering them is run over the river hydropower, water power, hydroelectric power, is that we use weirs. And those weirs now, for many of them, aren't doing their original purpose. And so they're being allowed to decay and run into problems. But at the moment, what seems to be the biggest issue is that they are seen by the regulatory bodies as barriers. And that's fundamental, that's written into the Water Framework Directive. And we've got a local interpretation problem in the Trent catchment, in that we are seeing Derbyshire Wildlife Trust and similar bodies and the Environment Agency blaming the Industrial Revolution weirs for stopping salmon. Which has never made any sense to me. My research about the industrial mill owners was that they were as interested in fish and salmon as anybody. And that's just never really sat well, which was part of the reason for the PhD. On the right-hand side, there is a weir that was a formal mill weir, replaced as a flood weir in 1970s, removed, I think it was in 2022. And of course, the area flooded and the school flooded for the first time 6 weeks after that weir was removed. But it was nothing to do with the weir removal, we are assured. And in the bottom, there is a £12 million fish pass just completed on the Trent, which is in the middle of 7 other weirs. So that's one in the middle, the other 7 haven't got fish passes. So, did the Industrial Revolution weir stop the salmon? The evidence I was aware of was that the struts in Belper were congratulated for their very complete pass for salmon at their sites at Belper and Milford. And as a migratory species, that suggested that salmon were travelling all the way up through the Trent and up the Derwent, long after the Industrial Revolution weirs were built. So there was something there to go and be investigated. And the main findings from the investigation was that we had a similar massive decline in salmon in the mid 1800s. And as a result, there was an inquiry that went to every catchment in England and Wales and spoke to the landowners, the anglers, all the relevant bodies, and all of the evidence is still there, sat in an inquiry document at Parliament Archives. And there were stories and explanations about how the mill owners tended to open the gates on a Sunday when they weren't operating. One mill that had rights to salmon insisted that all the navigation weirs upstream had 3-foot sluices built in that were open all the time. So these were sort of just anecdotal comments by the local people. The actual inquiry report referenced the Saturday slap within Scottish law and also Queen's Share, which was all built into existing Scottish law. So when all of the Salmon Acts were unified in 1861, they included everything they did fundamentally still protected milling power because it was so important to local communities and the economy of the country. So improvements could be made, but they were at the cost of the conservator. If gratings were added, then the lead needed to be widened to maintain flows. And they also introduced nightly close times and weekly close times, which are still actually sat in legislation and not well understood, if at all. So we were in a situation where we got the weirs. They were creating the head for water power. They were diverting the water, and in some cases, they were storing water in the form of a dam or a mill pond. And any surplus would then go over the weir. We've got the wheels that were used for either just powering the mill during the day or producing electricity during the day or whenever the mill was operating. So they're used as and when needed, not wasted. And then gates, sluices, floodgates, different words were attached to all these weirs that were used for flood management and river level control. And the interesting bit from the research that in non-milling time, so on a Sunday or at night time in some cases, the dams would be refilled, but the gates would be open to allow maintenance, allow navigation, which was a standard feature, and also fish passage. And the most interesting thing I found in the research was an explanation to conservators that the Salmon Fishery Act included a weekly close time, which married up with when the upper proprietors shared the fresh rum and salmon. So they simply opened the gate to redistribute the fish over the district, a solution that was in place and it was reflected. At the time of the inquiry, some local people were concerned about pollution and not the weirs. So it was raised in the Derbyshire, and I believe it was raised in other catchments as well. So in the 1860 inquiry, they mentioned pollution. 1950, there was a major pollution court case in Derby. So it meant for 90 to 100 years, effectively, the river was dying through pollution. Weirs became they weren't even being talked about by the end of the 1800s. It was pollution from the domestic cities, but also from industry. So when we start building weirs in the 20th century, there are no fish in the river anymore. There is no allowance for fish. There's no gates. It's not even being thought about in the 20th century. So we built our reservoirs, Ladybower, Derwent, Howden. We've introduced gauging weirs for river management, and none of these facilitate fish passage. We had a project around Derby that reclaimed land and also managed floodwaters, building 3 more weirs. None of them facilitated fish passage because the river was dead. It didn't matter. And finally, we started seeing some weirs being replaced by flood weirs and gates. And again, no facilities for fish passage because the river was effectively dead. So we're now in this strange situation where we have these heritage weirs. So as before, they could create a head and divert water and store fuel for power. And today, a lot of these weirs are visitors' attractions, or alternatively, actually a liability to owners. And they're certainly seen as an obstruction within the Water Framework Directive. If we are generating power, we tend to be now generating it from a heritage mill, which might be producing goods, or as a visitor's attraction just during the day, or generating local clean energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Strangely, with most of these sites now, we need an abstraction license from the regulator to take water out for water power, and there is a hands-off flow. The strange feature for me, which is still not explained, is that more often than not, this hands-off flow has to go over the weir. So there is a measurement over the weir rather than going through available gates and sluices. So the gates and sluices, if in use, and most of them aren't, and are potentially another WDF obstruction, only take surplus flow. But most of these gates and sluices today aren't in use at all. My research, basically learning from the past, was hopefully we can start looking at variable flow regimes. So we're not fixed on a flow rate 24/7, 365 days of the year, where we can peak flow through water power generation, either to suit a mill operating through the day or a generator to maximize flow from 4 till 7 at the highest value. But then actually divert water possibly at night through sluice gates, and rather than sending water over weirs unnecessarily, take that water through gates, which would be quite a shift, but it would just facilitate water, fish passage and other improvements for the river. So summary, basically, yes, we have still got hydropower opportunities in the valley to help mitigate climate change, which potentially is the single biggest threat to the fisheries. But also we've got all these sluice gates and floodgates that we could be restoring and stewarding the river as we did in the Georgian period. So really, that's it. Anybody interested in the thesis, it is freely accessible.